911, what's your emergency?
I think something's wrong next door. The smell.
Ma'am, what's your address? And can you describe the smell?
1311 Pine Street. It smells like rotten meat. Please send someone.
We all have a deep, fundamental desire for connection. We seek it in other people, in our families, in our pets. We see these animals, these creatures we bring into our homes, as extensions of ourselves. They are our confidants, our silent companions, the beating hearts that fill the quiet corners of our lives. We believe we understand them. We believe we can tame them. We believe we can control the wildness that still lives deep within their bones. But what happens when that belief is a lie? What happens when the line between pet and predator blurs? When the domesticated facade crumbles to reveal something ancient and terrifying? This is a story about that line. It's a story about a man, a solitary figure in a small Pennsylvania apartment, who surrounded himself with a deadly kind of love. It's a story about the monsters we invite into our lives, and the horrifying truth that some monsters can never truly be tamed. The loss of a loved one is a pain unlike any other. But what happens when that loss is not just an accident, but an act of brutal, cold-blooded consumption? What happens when the very creatures you swore to protect turn and see you as nothing more than prey? Ronald Huff was a man of quiet habits and a singular passion. He wasn't a partygoer, not a social butterfly. He was a creature of routine, a man who found comfort in the predictable rhythms of his own life. For years, he'd worked as a truck driver, the endless miles of highway his constant companion. The isolation of the open road suited him. It gave him space to think, space to be alone with his own thoughts. But as the miles passed, something shifted. A different kind of loneliness began to creep in. In the quiet hours after a long haul, when the hum of the engine had finally faded, Ronald found himself looking for something more, something to fill the silence. That's when he discovered his passion for reptiles. It started innocently enough. A few snakes, a couple of bearded dragons, harmless, manageable pets that fit neatly into the small world he had built for himself. But for Ronald, it was never about the small and the safe. It was about the grand, the ancient, the powerful. It was about touching the untamed world without ever leaving his living room. His apartment on Pine Street wasn't a home in the traditional sense. It was a sanctuary, a terrarium built for one. The air was thick with a humid, earthy smell. The walls were lined not with family photos, but with tanks and cages of all shapes and sizes. This was his kingdom, and he was the king. He was a kind man, his neighbors said. He'd offer a friendly nod in the hallway, a quiet wave from his stoop. But no one truly knew what waited behind his locked door. No one knew the true extent of the world he was building for himself. He spoke of his pets with a kind of reverence. They weren't just animals. They were an obsession. He'd talk about their ancient lineage, their powerful jaws, their predatory instincts. He saw them not as dangerous, but as misunderstood. He believed he had a special connection with them, a bond that transcended the natural order of things. He would describe the feeling of their scaly skin, the way they would watch him with their cold, unblinking eyes. He saw their predatory stillness not as a threat, but as a sign of trust. A sign that they knew he was their provider, their protector. He was wrong. His friends and family knew about his hobby. They'd seen the bites, the scratches, the constant signs of his dangerous devotion. He would always laugh them off, a grimace barely hidden by a forced smile. "They're just playing," he'd say. "They don't mean anything by it." He'd show off the scars on his hands and arms like badges of honor, proof of his unique connection to these animals. But the bites were getting worse. The wounds were deeper, the healing slower. The unspoken truth was that his pets were not playing. They were testing. They were reminding him of their true nature, one bite at a time. The line between pet and predator was not just blurring, it was beginning to crumble. The centerpiece of Ronald Huff's strange menagerie was a monitor lizard of truly terrifying proportions. We're not talking about a docile gecko or a friendly chameleon. This was a Komodo dragon hybrid, a creature of immense power and primal instinct. Monitor lizards are an ancient species, but the Komodo dragon is a different beast entirely. They are the largest living species of lizard, growing up to 10 feet in length and weighing over 200 pounds. This hybrid, a mix of Komodo and another large monitor species, was every bit as large and imposing. It was a hulking, muscular reptile, its body covered in tough, armor-like scales. Its head was massive, with a wide, lipless mouth filled with jagged, serrated teeth. But it wasn't just its size that made it so dangerous. Komodo dragons are venomous. They don't just bite and tear, they deliver a potent cocktail of venom and bacteria that causes a massive drop in blood pressure, prevents blood clotting, and sends their prey into a state of shock. It's a slow, agonizing process, a death by 1,000 cuts from a single bite. The Komodo dragon is an apex predator. They hunt deer, wild boar, and even buffalo. They have no natural fear of humans. Their behavior is driven by a few simple, powerful instincts: hunger, territoriality, and a ruthless efficiency in hunting. Ronald's pets, raised in the cramped confines of a small apartment, were no different. They were wild animals, pure and simple. There were no warnings to be read in their behavior. The warning was in their very existence. Every hiss, every flick of their forked tongue, every slow, deliberate movement was a reminder of what they truly were: hunters waiting for an opportunity. And Ronald, in his devotion, was slowly, tragically becoming that opportunity. The bites were the first sign. In the beginning, they were small, almost playful nips. Ronald would show a friend a bandage on his hand and say, "Oh, that's just Spike being a little grumpy today." But the bites became more frequent, more vicious. A friend once visited and saw Ronald with a deep gash on his arm, the wound oozing and inflamed. The friend, alarmed, urged him to see a doctor. Ronald refused, simply dabbing it with antiseptic and wrapping it himself. He was embarrassed, perhaps, but more than that, he was in denial. He refused to admit that his pets, his beloved companions, were not just unpredictable, they were actively dangerous. There were other, more subtle signs. The neighbors. They complained about the smell. Not just a faint odor, but a heavy, putrid stench that would occasionally seep into the hallway, especially on hot days. It was a smell of decay, of something feral and unclean. They'd knock on his door, but Ronald would rarely answer. He was becoming a recluse, his world shrinking to the four walls of his apartment and the scaly creatures within. The outside world, with its demands and its warnings, was a distant, unimportant thing. The biggest red flag was the sheer number of animals. 6 large monitor lizards, including the Komodo hybrid, all crammed into a small 2-bedroom apartment. The sheer logistics of feeding and caring for them was a monumental task, one that was becoming too much for a man who was already battling his own health issues. The lizards were often left hungry, their primal hunger building to a fever pitch. In their world, hunger was a constant companion, a deep, gnawing feeling that drove every action. When their human provider failed to deliver, that hunger turned from a passive ache into a violent, aggressive need. The stage was set. The warnings were ignored. The clock was ticking. The day started like any other. The sun cast a gray light through the grime-streaked windows of Ronald Huff's apartment. The air was heavy, humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and animal musk. Ronald, a man whose health was already in decline due to an undiagnosed heart condition, was alone with his reptilian family. We can imagine the scene: the slow, rhythmic clicking of his air conditioner, the faint whir of a fan, the shifting sounds of 6 large predators in their enclosures. Ronald, perhaps feeling unwell, perhaps just tired, moved through his small space. He may have been preparing food for them, a task that had become a routine of almost religious significance. Or maybe he was simply walking from one room to another. No one will ever know the exact trigger. But at some point his body, already weakened by a failing heart, gave out. He may have collapsed from a sudden, fatal seizure. He may have stumbled and hit his head on a piece of furniture. The end result was the same: a sudden, jarring moment of incapacitation. A man, once in control, now sprawled on the floor, helpless. For a brief, agonizing moment, the world would have gone silent. The lizards, creatures of instinct, would have sensed the shift, the stillness, the vulnerability. Their cold, unblinking eyes, which had for so long regarded him as the source of food, now saw him as something else entirely. They saw prey, the scent of fear, the change in the rhythm of his breathing, the sudden, unnatural stillness. It was a signal, a powerful, undeniable call to action that resonated deep within their ancient brains. The first one would have moved, a slow, deliberate slither, a predatory glide across the linoleum floor. Then, the others would have followed. The attack was not a chaotic frenzy. Not at first. It was a systematic, terrifying act of consumption, a testament to their predatory efficiency. They would have used their powerful jaws, their serrated teeth to tear at his flesh. The venom and bacteria from their bites would have gone to work, a silent, deadly cocktail spreading through his blood. We can imagine the sounds, the tearing of muscle, the sickening crack of bone, the wet, rhythmic sounds of chewing. There would have been no screams from Ronald, just the silence of a man who was already gone, and the terrifying sounds of the world he had created turning on him. It was a feeding frenzy, a quiet, horrifying, and complete act of nature unfolding in the middle of a Pennsylvania apartment. The 911 call from the concerned neighbor, a woman named Eleanor, was the first domino to fall. She had lived next to Ronald for years, a polite but distant acquaintance. The smell, however, was impossible to ignore. When officers from the local police department arrived at 1311 Pine Street, they were immediately hit by the stench. It was a thick, almost palpable odor that seeped out from under Ronald's door and into the hallway. It was a smell of death and decay, a smell so potent and wrong that it sent a shiver down the spine of even the most hardened officer. After a series of unanswered knocks and calls, they decided to force entry. The sound of the door being kicked in echoed through the quiet building. The sight that greeted them was something out of a nightmare. The small apartment was a scene of utter chaos and horror. The floor was covered in what looked like a dark, viscous liquid. The air was thick and heavy, a humid, tropical-like atmosphere that was at odds with the suburban Pennsylvania setting. And then they saw them. The lizards, the 6 large monitor lizards, moving with a slow, deliberate menace, their forked tongues flicking in the air, tasting the fear in the room. The officers, armed with nothing more than their standard-issue pistols, were faced with a situation they were completely unprepared for. They had walked into a predator's den. Ronald's body was a gruesome, almost unrecognizable sight on the floor. It was partially consumed, his flesh torn away in large chunks. The officers, shocked and horrified, immediately backed out and secured the apartment. This was no ordinary crime scene. This was a biohazard, a dangerous animal situation, and a nightmare of a rescue operation all rolled into one. They immediately called for backup from animal control and other specialized units. The scene was a cacophony of sirens, shouting, and panicked radio calls. Animal control officers, equipped with tranquilizer guns and catch poles, finally managed to subdue the lizards. The Komodo hybrid, the largest and most aggressive, proved to be the most difficult. It was a struggle, a battle of wits and force against a primeval hunter. When all 6 animals were finally contained and removed, the medical examiner could enter. The scene was documented, photographed, and carefully analyzed. The medical examiner's report would later be a chilling clinical account of the devastation, detailing the numerous bites, the signs of consumption, and the undeniable fact that Ronald Huff's pets had not just been present at his death, they had been the cause. The animals were later transported to a specialized facility, their fate sealed by their actions. The death of Ronald Huff sent shockwaves through the quiet Pennsylvania community, and eventually the entire country. The story was a morbid curiosity, a tale of a man devoured by his own pets. The media descended upon Pine Street. Reporters stood outside the now sealed apartment building, their microphones aimed at anyone who would talk. Neighbors, friends, and family members were all thrust into the spotlight, forced to grapple with the horrifying truth of what had happened. The local news ran endless segments on the incident, featuring dramatic reenactments, and expert commentary from herpetologists and animal behaviorists. It was a feeding frenzy, a media spectacle fueled by public fascination with the grotesque and the macabre. The story of Ronald Huff's death became a cautionary tale, a grim warning about the dangers of keeping exotic animals as pets. Animal Planet, with its popular series Fatal Attractions, would later dedicate an entire episode to the incident, immortalizing Ronald's tragic end in a chilling, minute-by-minute account. The autopsy report was a brutal, clinical summation of the horrors. The medical examiner's findings confirmed that Ronald had died from a combination of his pre-existing heart condition and the extensive injuries inflicted by the lizards. The bites, the lacerations, the partial consumption of his body. It was all there, a horrifying testament to the power of these animals. But the report also noted that a seizure or collapse likely preceded the attack. It was a tragic confluence of a man's failing health and his pet's predatory instincts. The animals hadn't been malicious. They had simply been animals, acting on their primal, hardwired programming. Legally, there were few consequences. Ronald Huff was dead, and there was no one to prosecute. The animals were taken by animal control, and their fate, while not widely publicized, was sealed. They were too dangerous to be rehomed or rehabilitated. The public reaction was mixed. Some were horrified, calling for stricter laws on exotic pet ownership. Others were more philosophical, arguing that Ronald had known the risks and that the tragedy was a grim but predictable outcome. There were protests, small but vocal, from animal rights activists who argued that the lizards were not to blame, that the true villain was the human who had imprisoned them in an unnatural environment. The Pine Street apartment was sealed off for months, a grim monument to the events that had transpired inside. The smell, a faint but persistent echo of the tragedy, lingered long after the building had been cleaned. For Eleanor, the neighbor who made the 911 call, the memory would forever be etched in her mind. The smell, the silence, the sudden, terrifying hiss on the phone line. It was a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The case of Ronald Huff, while closed, would forever serve as a chilling reminder of the fine, often invisible line that separates man from nature and pet from predator. The story of Ronald Huff is not just a tale of a man's gruesome death. It's a story about the lies we tell ourselves, the lie that we can bend the natural world to our will, that we can domesticate the truly wild, that we can control the instincts that have been honed over millions of years of evolution. Ronald Huff didn't just die. He became a part of the very world he had so desperately tried to possess. He became food for the monsters he had invited into his home, a final, horrifying testament to their true, untamed nature. The question that lingers in the silence is not whether his pets were evil, but whether he ever truly understood what they were. And in that silence, we are left to wonder about our own small, domesticated worlds and the wildness we all pretend we have under control. The last sound Ronald Huff ever heard it was the tearing of his own flesh. And the last thing he ever saw, if he saw anything at all, was the cold, unblinking eye of the creature he had so foolishly believed was his friend.